Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vittorian, and this is the 25th Hour. Thank you for joining us for this week of October 11th to the 17th, 2020. We talk about the city recovering from its coronavirus spike in numbers, De Blasio and Cuomo kind of being on the same page now, Donald Trump and Joe Biden's dueling town halls, and a spike in activity in the Supreme Court. Let's start with de Blasio's administration. Authorities had issued 60 summonses totaling over $150,000 in fines against people, businesses, and religious houses of worship for not following pandemic restrictions and mask mandates. 878 New Yorkers were hospitalized on Monday alone for COVID, reflecting fears that a second wave will increase infections during the upcoming cold season. People still haven't forgotten about the confusion that happened between Cuomo and De Blasio when the mayor announced his school and business closures without the governor's say. The mayor admitted this week that he cut Cuomo out of the loop on purpose. Aside from the anger that arose from the Orthodox Jewish community, Brooklyn Borough President and mayoral candidate Eric Adams called for a loosening of restrictions on religious houses of worship, even if those religious institutions are located in hot zones. The harsh restrictions may have begun to pay off as Political New York reported that infection rates have started to level off. But Mayor de Blasio said people are still testing positive in some of the hot zone neighborhoods, quote, not moving in the right direction, end quote. With the threat of being fined for not taking proper precautions, there are less people around to infect each other. A study by the Regional Plan Association found that de Blasio's actions delaying reopening city schools and tracing infections only delays New York's future recovery. The Gothamist reported that 52% of students are now completely remote, abandoning in-person instruction altogether because of COVID infections and regulations. A report from Education Trust, a nonprofit institution, revealed that chances are that low-income students are more likely than students that come from high-income families to be completely remote in their studies. De Blasio responded to Cuomo's threat to pull funding from schools if regulations aren't enforced, saying that the governor's words were just bluster. Schools Chancellor Carranza said that only 15% of families who chose in-person learning consented to COVID tests, and thousands of requests from city schools for laptops and tablets for remote learning have not been resolved. Carranza said that 77,000 devices are still needed, raising the question, are there 77,000 kids still not learning remotely and falling through the cracks? Heshi Tischler, who is running for city council and also incited an attack on an Orthodox Jewish reporter last week during Orthodox Jewish protests against coronavirus restrictions, was taken in custody Sunday night. Nevertheless, Orthodox Jewish protesters massed outside the home of the Jewish journalist who was attacked, Jacob Kornblue. He was released from jail on Monday night, that's Tischler, and instructed his followers to stay away from Kornblue. The Orthodox Jewish dissenters that were front and center during the Borough Park anti-mask protests were influenced by misinformation and rumors spread by none other than President Trump, increasing in number through WhatsApp and religious forums, according to a report by Liam Stack and Joseph Goldstein in the New York Times. Public advocate Jumaane Williams is demanding a refund from the firm that messed up the Brooklyn absentee ballots, causing voters to get envelopes with other voters' information. The company, called Phoenix, had never mailed ballots for voters for the Board of Elections before. Phoenix received almost $1.1 million from its contract from the city, but elected officials like State Senator Brad Hoylman are calling for damages to be paid for breach of contract for a full price of $4.6 million. The screw-up in Brooklyn led to calls to add 2 board leaders to the Board of Elections, which the city council planned on adding political connects. Rodney Pepe Souvenir and Jose Araujo, a reappointment, were voted onto the Brooklyn delegation for the Board of Elections on Thursday. Pivoting to the mayoral election, a report in the newly launched New York Focus talked about how city's comptroller Scott Stringer increased the amount of money the city's pension fund invested in private equity real estate with high fees and high risk, leading to almost $400 million of losses in the pension fund. As the report says, Stringer may not have received a lot of scrutiny in this area, but considering the pension fund has around $221 billion in assets, it might be a drop in the bucket. The first mayoral election forum took place at the Jim Howe's Liberal Democratic Club, still without de Blasio's former Veteran Services Commissioner Laurie Sutton. At the forum, the mayoral hopefuls distanced themselves from de Blasio, discussed different ways to get the city out of its budget hole, and what their policy priorities are. Raymond McGuire, Citigroup's vice chair, also announced this week that he's leaving his job officially to prepare running for mayor. ICE agents are shown on video pretending to be local police during an attempted detention of a man from Inwood, Manhattan. Fernando Santos Martinez was detained at his job after his partner opened the door for officers claiming they were local police, but in fact were ICE. New York City law says city employees do not enforce federal immigration law, so the NYPD wouldn't do this. Mayor de Blasio sent a letter to ICE demanding that agents stop pretending to be NYPD. The NYPD is preparing for possible civil unrest in time for the presidential election and the confirmation vote for Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. The political climate has put people on edge more than ever, and the police department is attempting to get ready to respond. This coming on the heels of Chief of Patrol Fausto Pichardo resigning, reportedly because of political disagreements with Mayor De Blasio. The department is still trying to make inroads with the community, hosting 8 town halls in order to hear the community's opinions on how the police can make changes to their practices. Maybe one of the things that might come up is that youth of color still get arrested 93% of the time, despite a drop in youth arrests by 40% after the Raise the Age law took effect, according to a study done by the Youth Justice Research Collaborative. The Civilian Complaint Review Board voted Wednesday to substantiate a complaint that Officer Wayne Isaacs used excessive force when he fatally shot Delron Small, who was unarmed, during a 2016 road rage incident on Atlantic Avenue. Just after the reporting came out last week announcing the closure of the Manhattan Metropolitan Detention Complex and a jail on Rikers Island, Elizabeth Flazer, the head of the effort to close Rikers generally, has announced she's leaving the de Blasio administration at the end of the month. The opposition arising from lower Manhattan neighbors to their new homeless neighbors in the Radisson Hotel from the Upper West Side's Lucerne Hotel has grown to a new level. A group of residents and businesses sued the city to prevent 240 homeless men from moving into the hotel homeless shelter led by Downtown New Yorkers Inc., an organization created just to fight de Blasio's decision, but lost in their attempt to get emergency relief in court. Meanwhile, an NYU study found that renters that live just outside the city will owe up to $40 million in rent due to the pandemic. New York City's census response rates were released. The city's response rate as a whole is 61.6%, which is 5% below the national average. Moving on to the City Council. The council considered a bill by Queens Councilman Donovan Richards that would forbid the police from secretly collecting children's DNA, something Richards called a genetic stop and frisk. Diana Ayala, the councilwoman who co-sponsored the bill, said the police would still be allowed to collect DNA from crime scenes and victims. Councilman Barrett decided that he will not seek re-election for his council seat covering Northeast Queens. Grodenchik said that being a politician has borne a heavy toll on his family. There are already 3 challengers lined up to take Grodenchik's seat, which would have been a tough fight for the former community board leader. There are positives and negatives associated with Grodenchik. He helped spur renovations to the Vanderbilt Motor Parkway and added thousands of seats to overcrowded schools in his district, but was accused of sexual harassment last year, causing him to resign his chairmanship of the Parks and Recreation Committee last May. Many other city council members are term limited next year, with city council members only allowed to serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms. Peter Vallone, the councilman representing Astoria, Queens, is one of those term-limited council members. Austin Shaffron, who lost to Vallone in the Democratic primary 7 years ago, is set on replacing him. Following Andy King's expulsion from the city council, a former staffer is suing the ex-council member because he told her to put a Band-Aid on it in response to her having to go to the emergency room for chronic vaginal bleeding. Papers were filed at Manhattan Supreme Court this week. And the City Council approved a law 46-2 that would allow restaurants to host outdoor dining year-round, expediting the certification process and getting rid of a ban on propane heaters. So let's see what happens in the coming cold winter months to see how restaurants will accommodate diners who want to eat and have a good dining experience, but combating the freezing temperatures. Moving on to Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo is releasing a book based on his experience handling the pandemic, including dealing with the president, titled American Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic. However, he is getting criticism for releasing the book while the pandemic still rages on, making the timing feel off, writes Jimmy Vilkin for the Wall Street Journal. Cuomo said that the book was meant to be a halftime review of the pandemic. He continued to take point on the pandemic in the state, adding 3 more states to New York's quarantine list: Ohio, Michigan, and Virginia. So if you're from any of those 3 states, you are required by the state to quarantine for 2 weeks. Cuomo is pissed that local New York City governments aren't doing more to stem the rise in infections, basically saying that he's going to withhold state money from the city and other places if regulations aren't enforced. One example of a lack of enforcement took place in the town of Southampton, where an outdoor summer concert headlined by the Chainsmokers resulted in a $20,000 fine and the loss of the town's ability to hold similar events without the state's approval. The regulations only allowed 50 people to attend outdoor events, while the concert attracted 2,150 people. Meanwhile, Cuomo called for a meeting between state governors and President Trump to get ready for distributing a possible vaccine if one becomes available during Trump's tenure. The president's response to a call for a meeting was to point out that Cuomo missed 17 briefings meant for state governors. Rumors are swirling that Cuomo could be chosen as Biden's new attorney general if Joe Biden wins, causing staff at the National Governors Association, which Cuomo chairs now, to get ready to find another governor to replace him, Axios' Elena Trine and Hans Nichols reported. Cuomo said he wasn't interested in becoming Biden's attorney general on Tuesday, but said he would help Biden in any way he can. Biden's team took issue with candidates for Biden's cabinet this week, telling people to cool it with the jockeying in news articles. How's the state doing getting ready for Election Day, you ask? It's having a tough time, wrote Amanda Fries from the Times-Union. There are no more fears of a poll worker shortage, but an ocean of mail-in ballots and adapting to new rules and franchising voters is giving the state and local boards of election a run for their money. Meanwhile, the state's minor parties are still fighting for their life, with reporting from the Daily News monitoring the Working Families Party convincing voters to choose Biden on their section of the ballot. Cuomo recently passed executive orders that changed the thresholds for minor parties to stay on the ballot, now having to receive 2% of the vote for their candidate to stay alive. The Working Families Party started in 1998 from a coalition of labor unions and progressive community organizations. Cuomo unveiled a statue of Mother Cabrini in Battery Park, who is a Roman Catholic saint who is known for her support for Italian immigrants coming to the U.S. There was controversy when Cuomo announced the erection of Cabrini's statue last October because the city decided not to erect the statue itself, despite it being a favorite in an official survey. A committee led by New York City's First Lady Shirlane McRae selected 7 other women to make statues of, despite the survey results. Italian Americans were upset about McRae and her committee's choice, and Cuomo decided to put out Cabrini's statue after. The Cabrini statue's erection came on Columbus Day, with an ongoing national push to replace the holiday with Indigenous Peoples Day. In Syracuse, the hostility towards the man who sailed the ocean blue in 1492 was punctuated by the removal of a Columbus statue at its Columbus Day celebration. Cuomo had also announced this week that Juneteenth is officially a state holiday in New York. Juneteenth is the celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, stemming from a June 19, 1865 event when Major General Granger delivered the news to slaves in Texas that the Civil War had concluded and that the slaves were from then on free. In Buffalo, New York, the Common Council is trying to put Mayor Brown's order limiting no-knock warrants into law with the addition of making police use amplified speakers to make sure inhabitants hear the police and making sure that there's never a repeat of the Breonna Taylor case that happened in Kentucky. The Rochester, New York City Council is thinking about a study looking into the police department that can cost $250,000. The study would be conducted by the law firm Wilmer Hale, answering calls to look into the RPD's culture after the death of Daniel Prude. Suffolk County's Islip City Council is going to look really different following a settlement in a voting rights case that alleged a lack of Hispanic representation in the local legislative body. Islip will create 4 new council districts next year, represented by a town board member. The districts will be created in neighborhoods where most of the town's Hispanics live. A black police officer in the Troy Police Department filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city, saying that the department's systemic racism caused his career in life to suffer. A grand jury did not charge 3 police officers in the killing of Tyrell Fincher in March in the city of Newburgh. After police looked for Fincher regarding a shots fired investigation, Fincher was shot by the police officers after Fincher allegedly tried firing his gun at them. A gun was found in Fincher's possession. The Long Island Railroad plans to install new ventilation systems in its trains to purify the air and prevent airborne viruses like the coronavirus. While it works on that, though, the LIRR says air is filtered about 44 times an hour, and a third of the air is pulled in fresh from the train car's roof. This is your weekly reminder that New York State is in a budget crunch, including the MTA, which is in a $12 billion hole. A report by State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli says that if the authority doesn't get the money to cover its debts, service will be slower and prices may increase. The MTA is framing its budget woes in terms of equity for low-income New Yorkers, warning federal lawmakers that the lack of money for the MTA is only going to kick poor Americans down. Additionally, the MTA Inspector General released a report saying that the contractor approval process the authority goes through is flawed, where every contractor passes under the MTA's criteria, eventually never knocking out poor bids. The State Office of Children and Family Services is getting hit for suppressing the death of 700 children over the past decade, according to the Times-Union. The reporting criticizes the OCFS's discretion whether to release reports that reveal CPS workers' mistakes or shortcomings may have led to deaths of the children under their caseload. The OCFS said that the child protective agencies have discretion to not release reports if that was in the best interest of the surviving siblings or other children in the household, and that the main state agency can overrule a county agency if need be. But OCFS has not provided an example of an episode where it overrode a county suppression decision. A heads up, starting Monday, make sure to bring your own bag to stores, as the state's plastic bag ban is set to go into effect. After months of delays and lawsuits, the law meant to protect the environment by limiting the spread of plastic bags is moving into effect. One New Yorker from White Plains, New York, is allegedly responsible for 2 Facebook pages aimed at liberals and conservatives separately, garnering millions of likes, comments, and reposts with content catered to either side and furthering the divide. Sean Winston's email is connected to the Facebook pages and did not respond to a comment in relation to Politico's investigation. Moving on to Albany. 2 Long Island state lawmakers got endorsements from Biden and Kamala Harris this week. State Senators Kevin Thompson and Jim Goffrin got the former vice president's approval to continue holding on to their Long Island seats. State Republican lawmakers are relying on one billionaire to regain the state Senate majority, and it isn't Donald Trump. Ronald Lauder, the billionaire cosmetics heir of Estee Lauder, has poured $2.9 million into ads through the group Safe Together New York, an independent expenditure group he founded. He had committed $4 million to the group as a whole. In an attempt to do something to plug the state's budget hole, State Senator Andrew Gennardis and Assemblyman Peter Abate introduced a bill in their separate chambers to incite early retirement incentives for public employees. The incentives include extra pension credits and no benefit reductions for retiring early at the age of 55. State Senator Brian Benjamin announced his candidacy to run for New York City Comptroller, joining an increasingly crowded field that already has Councilman Brad Lander, Queens Assemblyman David Weprin, and Brooklyn State Senator Kevin Parker in the ring. One thing that set Benjamin apart is the fundraising advantage he has, which makes him compete directly with Lander. Moving on to the state courts, State Supreme Court Justice Mark Grisanti admitted to shoving a cop and using Buffalo Mayor Byron Brown's name to get a light treatment in a June incident. Erie County District Attorney John Flynn Jr. decided he wasn't going to charge anyone in the incident, including the justice's wife, with the incident arising out of a dispute between the justice's wife and their neighbors. Justice Grisanti can be seen as being inebriated and shirtless in the video when he shoved the police officer. The New York Judges Association attacked the decision for the state court system to retire older judges following a $300 million budget cut for the state judiciary system due to the pandemic. The Judges Association said that cutting out older judges would create and exacerbate the crisis in the judiciary system. Amy Cooper, the white woman that notoriously maliciously called the police on black birdwatcher Chris Cooper, had called the police a second time off camera to falsely accuse Chris Cooper of trying to assault her, according to Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. Amy Cooper pleaded guilty in Manhattan criminal court this week. An independent review led by former Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, now partner Paul Weiss, found that there is a culture of toxicity and unprofessionalism among New York court officers. The study included 96 interviews and involved 289 people. A number of plaintiffs have sued Cuomo in separate lawsuits challenging his coronavirus restrictions, closing non-essential businesses in the face of upticks and limiting religious gatherings. For one, a group of Brooklyn auto dealerships sued the governor over cluster restrictions. However, courts keep deciding in Cuomo's favor, saying the state has the right to make public health pronouncements. Most recently, a federal judge in the Eastern District of New York denied a motion by the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn. Moving on to President Trump. Trump held rallies this week in 4 states despite only recently being treated for coronavirus. It wasn't clear that Trump wasn't contagious anymore due to confusing pronouncements made by the president's medical team and his leading doctor, Dr. Sean Conley. Dr. Conley even released a memo earlier this week saying that Trump is not contagious anymore and that Trump tested negative on consecutive days. Just don't ask him which days. Reporters are facing the challenge of covering a president that flouts safety protocols, with major outlets refusing to come close to the president, his staff, and refusing to travel with the official White House motorcade. Prospects for a quick and easy coronavirus vaccine continue to dampen as well, with Johnson & Johnson and Eli Lilly becoming the latest companies to pause their vaccine trials due to an unexplained illness in a participant. You may recall that AstraZeneca had the same issue last month before resuming their trial everywhere but the United States. One more person that attended Justice Barrett's nomination announcement at the White House was Eugene Scalia's wife, Trish. Eugene Scalia, the late Justice Antonin Scalia's son, is the current Labor Secretary. Reporting also came out that Barron, Trump's youngest son, tested positive for coronavirus earlier after testing negative after First Lady Melania Trump released a blog post on the White House website. And while it's not clear what the health status of the president and his staff is, what's clear is that a document written by a hedge fund consultant that took part in sessions with Trump's National Economic Council, including Larry Kudlow, the director, were used as a basis for future stock trades that let investors beat market sell-offs while other investors not privy to private White House discussions faced uncertain market volatility. News at the end of the week made it sound like Pfizer was going to seek an emergency authorization from the FDA on their vaccine, but the company soon clarified that they would only be able to do so after the election. U.S. diplomats and security officials privately warned Nevada not to use Chinese test kits donated by the UAE over privacy and accuracy concerns, according to the AP. The Wall Street Journal reported that virus outbreaks led to delays in mammograms and other cancer screening procedures, causing missed and held-up diagnoses. Campaigns always try to use people's words in a way to advantage their candidate, but both Dr. Fauci and Mark Milley, the top general of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said they didn't give consent for their words or likenesses to be used in Trump's campaign videos. One ad made it look like Fauci praised Trump's recovery after he came out of Walter Reed Hospital from his coronavirus infection, with Fauci saying in the ad, "I can't imagine that anybody could be doing more." Fauci called for the ad to be taken down. In another ad, an image of Mark Milley watching the video of the raid that killed ISIS leader al-Baghdadi is shown, followed by the Trump campaign encouraging the viewer to request their ballot. Milley said that he never approved his image being used, with the military having strict rules against officers participating in politics. Following the cancellation of the October 15th debate, Biden planned on participating in a town hall moderated by ABC News. Trump then announced this week that Trump will participate in his own town hall moderated by NBC News at the same exact time as Biden's town hall. NBC received criticism for moderating the debate with accusations that it chose ratings over safety, as the president had only recently been cleared of having coronavirus. The day of the dueling town halls, Kamala Harris had to cancel travel and quarantine because 2 of her staff tested positive for the virus. Harris tested negative but took precautions. When it finally came time for Biden and Trump to have their separate town halls, the differences between the two were obvious. Trump refused to condemn QAnon, the fringe conspiracy group hailing Trump as a hero saving the world against pedophile cannibal Democrats, and YouTube actually banned QAnon accounts and other conspiracy content on Thursday. However, Trump concretely denounced white supremacy and promised a peaceful transition of power if he loses, although he continued to press lies about voting fraud. Biden's town hall had heavy discussions of policy, including education, tax cuts, and fracking, with some people saying that it was actually kind of boring. Biden made it clear that he wasn't a fan of court packing, however, and criticized Amy Coney Barrett for her judicial philosophy. And what is sure to make Trump upset, Nielsen TV ratings show that Biden had more viewers than Trump by almost 1.5 million people.
Did you take a test on the day of the debate, I guess, is the bottom line?
I probably did, and I took a test the day before and the day before, and I was always in great shape, and I was in great shape for the debate. As president, I can't be locked in a room someplace for the next year and just stay and do nothing. And every time I go into a crowd, I was with the parents of our fallen heroes. These people are the most incredible people. And they came up to me and they would hug me and they would touch me. And I'm not going to not let them do it.
When a president doesn't wear a mask or makes fun of folks like me when I was wearing a mask for a long time, then, people say, well, it mustn't be that important.
After contracting COVID-19 yourself, has your opinion changed on the importance of mask wearing?
No, because I was okay with the masks. I was good with it, but I've heard many different stories on masks.
If you listen to the head of the CDC, he stood up and he said, while we're waiting for a vaccine, and he held up a mask. You wear this mask, you'll save more lives between now and the end of the year than if we had a vaccine.
I knew it was a big threat. At the same time, I don't want to panic this country. I don't want to go out and say, everybody's going to die.
Isn't there a middle ground? You don't have to mislead, but you can...
No, there's not a middle ground. You have to be safe, you have to be vigilant, and you have to be smart.
Besides, you ain't black. What do you have to say to young black voters who see voting for you as further participation in a system that continually fails to protect them?
Well, I say, first of all, as my buddy John Lewis said, it's a sacred opportunity and right to vote. You can make a difference. If young black women and men vote, you can determine the outcome of this election. Not a joke. You can do that.
Mr. President, what will you and your administration do to better prepare our law enforcement officers to work in collaboration with the communities that they serve, and also to protect the lives of innocent Black and Latinos from police brutality and injustice?
Right. I fully understand the question, and I saw everything that you saw over the summer, and it was a terrible thing to watch. And some people don't like it when I say it, but a lot of people agree. I have done more for the African-American community than any president, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln.
You said you don't want to ban fracking. As you know, it's an important issue here in Pennsylvania. Not everyone buys your denial. A member of the Boilermakers Local 154, Sean Steffney, was quoted in the New York Times today saying, you can't have it both ways. It says you can't meet your goal to end fossil fuels without ending fracking. What do you say to people like Sean who doubt your denial because they think you want to keep that promise?
Tell them the Boilermakers overwhelmingly endorse me, okay? What I would do is I would stop giving tax breaks and subsidizing oil. We don't need to subsidize oil any longer, number one. We should stop that and save billions of dollars over time. What I would also do with regard to, the difference between me and the new Green Deal, they say automatically by 2030, we're going to be carbon free. Not possible.
So are you for it or against it? You say you're not for it, but in your website it says you call it a crucial framework. The Green New Deal.
My deal is a crucial framework.
I'm sure they'll ask you the white supremacy question. I denounce white supremacy. Okay. And frankly, you want to know something? I denounce Antifa and I denounce these people on the left that are burning down our cities, that are run by Democrats who don't
All
know
right,
what
while
they're
we're
doing.
denouncing, let me ask you about QAnon.
I just don't know about QAnon.
You do know.
I don't know. No, I don't know. What I do hear about it is they are very strongly against pedophilia, and I agree with that. I mean, I do agree with that, and I agree with it very
strongly. But there's not a satanic pedophile cult being run by.
I have no idea. I know nothing about that.
You don't know that? Okay.
No, I don't know that.
This
neither
week,
do you know that.
Okay, just this week, you retweeted to your 87 million followers a conspiracy theory that Joe Biden orchestrated to have SEAL Team 6, the Navy SEAL Team 6, killed to cover up the fake death of bin Laden. Now, why would you send a lie like that to your followers? You retweeted
That was a retweet. That was an opinion of somebody, and that was a retweet. I'll put it out there. People can decide for themselves. I don't take a position.
You're not like someone's crazy uncle. Your own FBI director says there is no evidence of widespread fraud.
Well, then he's not doing a very good job.
If I'm elected president, you will not hear me race baiting. You will not hear me dividing. You'll hear me trying to unify. And unify bring people together. When I said I was running because I wanted to unify the country, people said, well, they were the old days. We better be able to do it again. We better be able to do it again.
Mr. Vice President, if you lose, what will that say to you about where America is today?
Well, it could say that I'm a lousy candidate and I didn't do a good job. But I think, I hope that it doesn't say that we are as racially, ethnically, and religiously at odds with one another as it appears.
The children of presidential families and challengers going after the seat continue to come into scrutiny. Trump's adult children are accused of profiting off of the presidency, and Hunter Biden is constantly in conservative crosshairs for serving on the boards of Ukrainian and Chinese companies. Now, Political's Ben Schreckinger broke a story about Biden's son-in-law Howard Crane, who, while advising Biden's campaign on the coronavirus response, also has investments in healthcare startups that offer their own solutions to the pandemic. Biden is also facing heat about whether he would entertain court packing, the concept of adding more seats to the Supreme Court to gain a partisan advantage. Progressive advocates have been calling for some kind of reform to hit the Supreme Court after Trump managed to seat 2 justices to the court, and now will get a 3rd after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. President FDR historically threatened to pack the courts back when he was president, and if the Supreme Court failed to rule in his favor on the constitutionality of the New Deal. But Chief Justice Hughes at the time demurred to prevent such a move. Biden sounded like he was against court packing in the Democratic primary and refused to give out a statement either way right now. Kamala Harris also refused to answer whether Biden was in favor of court packing during her debate with Vice President Mike Pence. Biden finally hinted at his opposition to court packing, saying that he would rather focus on the race instead of being bogged down on the question. What Biden probably would rather not be bogged down in is also a New York Post exclusive that came out in the middle of this week, accusing Biden of meeting with his son Hunter's colleagues on the Burisma board, a Ukrainian gas company, when he was serving as vice president. Despite the Post pushing the story of some sort of bombshell, there was no proof showing Biden met with the board member, other than an email from the board member thanking Hunter for the opportunity, nor was there any other proof of impropriety. Republicans have attempted to tie Biden to the Ukrainian gas company that Hunter served on the board for, trying to say the vice president and his son were using the vice president's office to improperly influence Ukrainian politics and receive personal benefits. Despite multiple investigations, no evidence has emerged that showed Biden doing anything against U.S. policy, and if anything, took actions to make sure Burisma was investigated more effectively by exposing a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor, Viktor Shokin. The source of the Post information came from a laptop hard drive that a computer repair store owner copied, with some saying that the move was illegal. The owner also gave the FBI the hard drive back in December of last year, and the Post was alerted to the laptop's existence by Trump's former strategist, Steve Bannon, with Rudy Giuliani giving the Post copies of emails this past Sunday. Steve Bannon himself faces fraud charges for using nonprofit donations for personal use, and Giuliani has been accused of running a personal foreign policy campaign on behalf of the president to dig up dirt on Joe Biden. President Trump was impeached in the beginning of this year for trying to extract political support from Ukraine by promising to release funds already approved by Congress in exchange for damaging information on Joe Biden. The Senate, controlled by Republicans, did not convict the president. Social media sites were criticized by conservatives and the New York Post editorial board for suppressing shares of the Post story, with Facebook and Twitter saying they needed time to verify the sourcing behind the story in line with policies meant to safeguard against political disinformation so close to the election. Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee said they would issue a subpoena for Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey to come explain his company's decision to block the Post article. The Post reported that the White House was warned by intelligence officials that Giuliani was the target of a Russian intelligence operation to feed misinformation to Trump. Giuliani went on a trip to Ukraine last year and met with a known Russian spy in an attempt to dig up dirt on Joe Biden and his son Hunter. and Twitter had since stopped blocking the Post article about Hunter and Joe. After the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against Trump, giving the Manhattan DA another green light to get Trump's tax returns through Trump's accountants, Mazars USA, Trump's lawyers filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court for another shot to prevent authorities from receiving his tax returns. The Supreme Court had already ruled against Trump in the same case, saying Trump's accountants had to respond to the DA Cyrus Vance's subpoenas, knocking down Trump's arguments that he was immune from any kind of prosecution while he is president. This time around, Trump is trying to argue that the subpoena is overbroad and issued in bad faith. Last week, we reported how court documents revealed members of an armed militia group that were in favor of taking over the government were plotting the kidnapping of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Reporting also came out this week that revealed those same militia members, were planning to also kidnap Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. The two governors are known for their strict coronavirus regulations. The investigation, Attorney General Bill Barr started to see whether Obama and his officials improperly requested to unmask the identities of Americans in intelligence investigations, concluded without any charges nor a public report. U.S. Attorney John Bash left the Justice Department last week, denying Trump or the Attorney General from any political fodder that can be used against the Democrats. Unmasking refers to the practice of public officials to request to find out the identity of Americans that are redacted from foreign intelligence reports to get more context about a matter of national security. Trump tried making a conspiracy theory out of the practice, calling into question when Biden requested to unmask a member of Trump's campaign and reports about contact with Russian spies, who ended up being Michael Flynn. Two Americans, Sandra Lowley and Mikhail Gidada, who were held hostage by Yemeni rebels, were freed in a trade this week for 200 of the group's prisoners. Yemen has been in the middle of a civil war between the Saudi Arabian-backed government and rebels from the Iran-backed Houthi tribe since 2014. The remains of a third American, Bilal Fatin, were also returned. One cool thing to happen this week is that the U.S. and 7 other countries signed the Artemis Accords, agreeing to the rules for outer space behavior, including covering the surface of the moon. The accords covered the extraction of resources and safety zones in case of interstellar conflict and improves on the 1967 Outer Space Treaty signed under President Lyndon Baines Johnson. The acting United States Attorney in Brooklyn, New York, announced that his office will focus on low-level gun cases to stem the rise in gun violence in New York. Seth Ducharme is taking on the cases in lieu of the traditionally blockbuster investigations looking into mobsters and drug kingpins. Low-level gun cases are traditionally the province of local state district attorneys. The president made it a point to take the country out of treaties it's been a part of for years, including the New START treaty with Russia, which governs the number of nuclear missiles the two countries have. The treaty was signed between then-President Obama and then-Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. If Trump doesn't take any action to extend the treaty, it'll expire next year. The New York Times' David Sanger and Andrew Kramer reported that while Trump banked on an extension with added provisions favorable to the U.S., with the understanding that there's an agreement in place, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said it was practically crazy to think that there was any agreement in principle, including capping the number of nuclear missiles Russia has. Since then, Russian President Vladimir Putin has pitched an extension of the treaty by a year. The DEA arrested the former Mexican Defense Minister General Salvador Cienfuegos on drug and money laundering charges in Los Angeles. Cienfuegos is the highest Mexican government official to have been arrested in the U.S. in connection with the Mexican drug epidemic. The U.S. budget deficit reached $3.1 trillion this week, a record, as a result of spending by Congress and the White House to prevent a deeper recession during the pandemic. The government spent $6.55 trillion this past fiscal year ending in September 30th, double what tax revenue brought in. Despite promising to eliminate the national debt, Trump's policies increased the debt by almost $8 trillion. Mere hours after Trump said he wouldn't provide California recovery funds in response to wildfires, the White House flip-flopped. California has requested an emergency declaration from the federal government in order to access special funds, and although Trump declined at first, he changed his mind after reportedly talking on the phone with California Governor Gavin Newsom and with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's help. Trump has a history of animosity with California and vice versa, claiming that millions of people fraudulently voted in the state and constantly downplaying the state's record-breaking wildfires. We move on to Congress and start off in the House. Even though the prospects of a COVID relief bill passing before the election are slim, Trump's negotiators certainly make it look like they're still negotiating a relief package. Conor O'Brien wrote for Politico that Trump's Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were urging repurposing unspent PPP money for relief purposes. Pelosi's interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer went viral as well this week, pressing Pelosi on why she won't just compromise with Republicans on whatever COVID deal they wanted.
Even the members of your own caucus, Madam Speaker, want to accept this deal, $1.8 trillion.
What I say to you is, I don't know why you're always an apologist and many of your colleagues apologize for the Republican position.
What's wrong with $1.8 trillion?
Well, you know what? Do you have any idea what the difference is between the spending that they have in their bill and that we have in our bill?
Is that what this is all about? Not allow the president to take credit if there's a deal?
With all due respect, and you know we've known each other a long time, you really don't know what you're talking about.
These are incredibly difficult times right now, and we'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much for joining
we'll
us.
Leave it on the vote that you are not right on this, Wolf.
Trump pitched a $1.8 trillion deal with Pelosi, but Senate Majority Leader McConnell shot down any chance of such a deal passing through the Senate. Politico's Ali Mutnik wrote about the outlook for House Republicans for this upcoming election. It doesn't look like they're going to gain any seats or keep them. About 6 seats are in danger of being lost from the GOP, including Oklahoma and South Carolina, stemming from a massive fundraising haul from Democrats and continued zeal against the president as carried on from the 2018 midterms. Staten Island and Bay Ridge's Congressman Max Rose and former Republican mayoral candidate Nicole Malliotakis faced off in a debate on Wednesday. Rose is forced to take a very conservative approach despite being a Democrat, considering the Republican leanings of his district. In the contentious debate on New York 1, moderated by Errol Lewis, Rose defended his vote to impeach Trump, while Republican Assemblywoman Nicole Malliotakis was confronted of her prior record opposing the president herself. At one point, Malliotakis' mic had to be cut off for constantly violating the debate rules, and Rose said he wouldn't vote for Nancy Pelosi to be the next Speaker of the House.
A heated debate tonight for New York City's 11th congressional district.
Republican Nicole Malliotakis and Democrat Max Rose clashed on just about everything as they vie for the swing district. CBS 2's Jessica Layton live in Duncan Hills with the highlights, and there were a lot. Jessica.
There sure were, Maurice and Christine. This race for Congress here on Staten Island is arguably one of the nastiest in the country. And tonight during this debate, we saw why.
I'm running for Congress to replace Max Rose, somebody who has misrepresented our community and voted 97% of the time with Nancy Pelosi against our values.
We'll have enough time to deal with your lies throughout the course of this conversation.
The hostility in this hotly contested congressional race between incumbent Democrat Max Rose and Republican Assemblywoman Nicole Malliotakis was obvious right out of the gate, beginning with arguments over mass gatherings and rallies.
Nicole hosted what could have potentially been a massive super spreader event.
Max was marching in front of our local police precinct with the defund the police crowd, even earlier than it was really at the height of this pandemic.
The two hammered away at each other on the response to coronavirus, taxes, and the impeachment of President Trump. The stakes are high in this swing district that covers Staten Island and southern Brooklyn. Voters took note of the negative tone long before the virtual face-off.
It's become a very nasty, extra political. It's going to be an ugly race.
I see it on the ads. They're always saying that they're frauds.
It's everything you hate about politics, all in one person. Nicole Malliotakis, the first-class fraud.
The only thing standing between us and violent chaos is a thin blue line. A line radically shrinking thanks to liberals like Congressman Max Rose.
I would never turn my back on the NYPD as our congressman did.
The debate frequently came back to the issue of police reform, the Army veteran disputing the point that he's out to defund police several times.
I was opposed to defunding right from the get-go, but
well, you didn't say anything about it, and let him
answer.
That part of the conversation got so contentious, the candidates' mics were cut.
Nicole, right between the signs.
Are we going to have to?
And those attacks just continued on Twitter tonight. Now, one little interesting nugget that we learned during this debate, neither candidate supports a federal mask mandate. A reminder that early voting here in New York starts on October 24th. That is 10 days from now. We're live from the Duncan Hills section of Staten Island tonight. Jessica Layton, CBS 2 News.
Moving on to the Senate. The Senate Judiciary Committee held Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court confirmation hearings from Monday to Thursday, despite a number of Republican senators having tested positive for coronavirus. Mike Lee, who attended Barrett's Rose Garden confirmation announcement event, was physically present at the hearing without his mask. Barrett wore a mask the entire time on the first day, but didn't wear a mask in the subsequent days, but she was sitting by herself at a table. Republicans weren't the only ones not socially distancing or following coronavirus guidelines. The ranking members of the Judiciary Committee, Dianne Feinstein, was also not wearing a mask, and then at the end of the hearings, hugged the chair of the committee, Lindsey Graham, after also saying that these are the best confirmation hearings she's ever seen. Democrats, wary of falling into the Republicans' hands, are avoiding any criticism of Barrett's faith and instead are pointing out the potential dangers of a Barrett court striking down the ACA and millions of people losing their health insurance. Barrett was asked about whether she would recuse herself from possible lawsuits about the election, with Barrett saying she wouldn't recuse because any potential lawsuit can have a dizzying array of fact patterns. Additionally, Barrett said that she had made no commitment to the White House on how she would rule on cases involving abortion or health care. Although she notably said Roe v. Wade, the law codifying the right to an abortion, was not a super precedent incapable of reversal. The Seventh Circuit judge and Notre Dame professor holds originalist views stemming from her work under late Justice Antonin Scalia that said the text of the Constitution and corresponding laws should be interpreted by their plain meaning as the framers and authors understood them at their conception. Despite Democratic members confronting Barrett with her past writings espousing conservative views against abortion and the Supreme Court's past Obamacare decision, Barrett claimed she didn't have an agenda and refused to answer any hypothetical brought before her, which is par for the course for judicial nominees since RBG's own confirmation hearing. A 538 analysis concluded that Amy Coney Barrett, although she might be the most conservative judge on the Seventh Circuit, is, quote, statistically indistinguishable, end quote, from the other conservative Supreme Court justices, with moderate views on employment discrimination, labor, and criminal defense cases, but more conservative on civil rights cases. After the end of the last hearing, Senate Judiciary Chair Lindsey Graham announced that a vote on Barrett's confirmation to come out of committee will be held on October 22nd. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell debated his challenger Amy McGrath. One moment that went viral was when McGrath, a former Air Force pilot, said McConnell hasn't done anything about the pandemic, which prompted McConnell to laugh.
The Senate went on vacation. I mean, you just don't do that. You negotiate. Senator, it is a national crisis. Yeah. You knew that the coronavirus wasn't going to end at the end of July.
Polls in Kentucky continuously show McConnell running ahead of McGrath. Utah Senator and former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney released a statement decrying the country's partisan political climate and largely laid blame on President Trump. A report released by Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee revealed that U.S. border agents deported migrants to Honduras in an unauthorized operation. The agents were stationed in Guatemala at the time when a large group of migrants, which President Trump quipped as a caravan, were making their way up to the U.S. border. The State Department prohibits officers from taking direct enforcement action when stationed in other countries. Georgia Senator David Perdue, who has worked alongside Senator and Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris for 3 years, mocked Harris's name in a Trump rally warm-up, spurring cries of outrage and accusations of racial animus.
Well, so often other candidates, like a senator running for re-election, will speak before the president arrives. And David Perdue was doing that. And what stands out is he's been in the Senate for a few years, a colleague of Kamala Harris, even working on some of the same committees. And he mispronounced her name. Perdue's Democratic opponent quickly jumped on that. To give you a sense of how this played, here's a clip from David Perdue.
The most insidious thing that Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden are trying to perpetrate, and Bernie and Elizabeth and Kamala, I don't know. Whatever.
Well, there you get the sense of what David Perdue was doing that Democrats viewed as mocking. His team says that Senator Perdue was simply mispronouncing Senator Harris's name, and he didn't mean anything by it. He was making an argument against the radical socialist agenda that she and her endorsed candidate, his opponent, Jon Ossoff, are pushing. So one of those moments that happens before even President Trump gets to the event is also making news in a critical race when the Senate is on the ballot and up for grabs this fall.
Republicans have made it a pattern to mispronounce and mock Harris's name, which has Indian roots. Perdue himself is locked in a tight race for his Senate seat, running against Jon Ossoff. Moving on to the judicial branch, which was really busy this week. 52% of registered voters said the winner of the presidential election should be the one to fill the open seat on the Supreme Court left by RBG. This went down from 57% the last time the question was asked last month. 62% of those polled by the Washington Post said the Supreme Court should uphold Roe v. Wade, the decision that guaranteed a woman's right to an abortion. The Supreme Court heard arguments in City of Chicago v. Fulton on Tuesday. The case is about whether a creditor, in this case the City of Chicago, has to return a debtor's vehicle when the debtor files for bankruptcy. Chicago towed Robin Fulton's car and he couldn't pay the city its fee, but a bankruptcy rule says that an automatic stay following bankruptcy mandates a creditor holding onto property passively has to give the debtor back their property. The question is whether the city has to comply with that rule. The High Court also heard arguments in the United States versus Briggs case. That case is actually about a military matter where Michael Briggs was convicted of a 2005 rape, but Briggs claims that the judge in his case never informed him of a statute of limitations issue preventing bringing any rape claims because the time limit legally ran out. Briggs is saying that if he was informed by the military court of any statute of limitations issue, he would have brought it up as a defense for dismissal. SCOTUS on Wednesday heard arguments in Torres v. Madrid, a Fourth Amendment case about whether physical force was used in detaining a suspect and whether that qualifies as a seizure. Roxana Torres was shot by police in 2014 when she was driving under the influence of meth and fled. 2 years later, Torres sued the two cops involved in the episode, saying that the shooting was a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment forbids unreasonable searches and seizures by the government, but the case might also affect the legal concept of qualified immunity, which prevents individual police officers from being sued by the public. The final case heard by the court on Wednesday was Pareda v. Barr, a case implicating U.S. immigration laws. Clemente Pareda pled no contest to a charge of attempted Social Security fraud to obtain a job and was later convicted of that crime. The issue is that once a crime of moral turpitude comes up, non-citizens can be deported, but Pareda said that the crime he was convicted of does not come up on the list of moral turpitude crimes under immigration law. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Texas Governor Greg Abbott's orders that established only one ballot drop-off box per county in the state, despite massive differences in population in every county. The trial-level judge had struck down the order, pointing out the disenfranchisement that can occur by ignoring the population differences, but the Fifth Circuit panel said there was no disenfranchisement possible since there are many different ways voters can cast their votes on the election. This year, states are presiding over the biggest growth in mail-in balloting the country has seen in recent times. 8.2 million people voted by mail so far, and 835,000 voted early physically, according to the Wall Street Journal. The Supreme Court declined to hear a case from 29 Senate Democrats accusing the president of violating the Emoluments Clause, a rarely used provision in the Constitution forbidding the president from profiting off of the position. The refusal to hear the case lets a lower court ruling stand that said that the senators didn't have standing to sue, or in other words, they weren't the right parties to bring the lawsuit. The High Court also refused to hear a case about a challenge to Planned Parenthood's funding. South Carolina's governor passed an order in 2018 forbidding Medicaid recipients from receiving health care from providers that also provide abortion services, which in this case would be the conservative boogeyman Planned Parenthood, which is the women's clinic that provides female health care services, which does include abortion. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that South Carolina could not block Medicaid recipients in that way. The Supreme Court gave the Trump administration some sort of favorable ruling this week after allowing the Census Bureau to quit counting the results from the census like they wanted. While the appellate court goes through the legal arguments as to whether the Census Bureau is allowed to end the count early, the High Court gave Trump reprieve to finish counting on October 15th instead of being obligated to finish counting through October 31st. The Supreme Court agreed to review the president's attempt to exclude undocumented immigrants from calculating congressional apportionment, one of the things made possible after a census count is done, setting the case for November 30th. A lower court ruled that Trump's efforts to do this were unlawful. The Southern District's Judge Jesse Furman ruled against the Department of Homeland Security, saying that the agency illegally kicked out 800,000 New Yorkers from a series of trusted traveler security programs counter to the Administrative Procedure Act. This ruling continues a theme with the Trump administration committing what the courts call, quote, arbitrary and capricious acts, not putting policies through the requisite processes. Montana Governor Steve Bullock's lawsuit against USPS leader Louis DeJoy has paid off as the USPS agreed to reverse changes that slowed down mail service throughout the country, settling the suit. DeJoy instituted a series of changes that slowed down mail service, including prescriptions and paychecks, by reducing hours, removing collection boxes and sorting machines, among others. D.C. District Judge Reggie Walton ordered the Department of Justice this week to file a brief on what President Trump exactly meant when he tweeted about declassifying every document related to Special Counsel Mueller's Russian election interference investigation. On October 6, Trump sent a series of tweets pledging to fully authorize the declassification of investigation records in the midst of court cases where petitioners are seeking open records requests. The DOJ initially just tried arguing in court that the president's tweets aren't official directives, but Judge Walton wasn't convinced, saying, quote, the American public has a right to rely on what the president says his intention is, end quote. The DOJ has until noon this upcoming Tuesday to submit their brief. And we're going to finish with national news. States are struggling to prevent pandemic unemployment fraud. Politicals Katie Murphy and Rebecca Rainey wrote that $8 billion have been stolen by criminals from Nigeria to London, meant for people who became unemployed as a result of the pandemic. The Labor Department's Inspector General estimates that another $26 billion can be lost to fraud. States simply don't have the capability to process the claims due to their old IT systems. If Congress doesn't pass any relief, millions of people will lose their unemployment benefits by the end of the year. The Labor Department also released a report this past Thursday that said unemployment claims increased to 888,000 last week, continuing the trend of claims hovering above 800,000 while the economy suffers under the pandemic. Consumer spending and factory output had also decreased. According to a study by Columbia University, 8 million people have fallen into poverty since May because they lost government support in the midst of business closures and layoffs. College enrollment fell 16% according to the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, while graduate enrollment increased by 2.7%, and the undergraduate population shrank by 4%. The pandemic has started to pick back up, validating warning signs that combined with the cold weather and an incoming flu season, more people are going to get sick and death counts will increase. As of the time of this recording, 220,000 people have died because of the virus and 8 million cases have been recorded. The first documented case of COVID reinfection occurred in Nevada, confusing the question of whether someone can become immune to the virus. This isn't the first time of alleged reinfections, but this is the first time it has become confirmed by a published study. Multiple states, 36 and counting, are seeing a dramatic increase in COVID hospitalizations. Europe has it worse, with more than 100,000 new infections a day. The wildfires still raging on the West Coast have exposed millions to hazardous pollution, according to the Associated Press, getting their information from pollution data and interviews with doctors and researchers. That's it for this week for the 25th hour. Thank you for joining us and letting us catch up with the week's news and beating the 24/7 news cycle together. Please support this podcast by rating, sharing it with your friends, and by subscribing to us wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to become a patron at patreon.com/the25th hour news. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.